Okay, so first of all, welcome to the conference, sir, and many congratulations for the award. Sir, I just have a few simple questions around cybersecurity. So I would like to know about the strategies and about the technology that a fintech companies basically employ to protect the customer data and ensure the robust cybersecurity in terms of transactions, especially in the fintech.
Yeah. First of all, thanks for inviting me to the conference, and again, yeah. So obviously, fintechs are one of the most basically vulnerable organizations with respect to data. We consume a lot of data, and the protections and the security around data is like massively important for fintechs, right? It starts with basically the data acquisition, right? So we want to make sure that we only get data that's actually applicable for us to serve the customers, right? So no excess data, right? So once we acquire the data, it actually goes through different phases of basically like both operational technology and other sort of solutions, right? So making sure that it has a complete 360-degree protection, right? So we want to make sure that it is properly access controlled. This access control is defined very properly for this. We want to make sure that all the technologies like encryption, basically de-identification, data masking, and all the procedures that we actually do are actually applied to the data that we actually acquire. Apart from that, there's always going to be continuous monitoring on the data to make sure that okay, like there is no data breach or there is no basically any kind of data exfiltration that happens that we don't know about. And on top of that, we also audit our data controls like every month, every quarter, and every year, right? So on an annual basis and quarterly basis, on a monthly basis, to make sure that we are following the best practices with respect to data security. So it's a very comprehensive 360-degree a program for all the data security and data privacy. Yeah.
So another question that just I came up with, like you said that the best practices we follow. So, are there any particulars like strategy or any certain things that, especially the fintech companies follow? Like there are a lot of best practices like password, multi-factor authentication, and everything. So, in terms of fintech company, are there something different that particularly these companies follow to safeguard the data of the customers, and how basically they approach? Basically there are two approaches: proactive approach and then the responsive approach. So how the fintech companies take it, which is the better approach?
Yeah, thanks. That's a very important question. So I think basically, like we have all the controls that the non-fintech companies actually need to take. That's for sure. So which are basically mostly proactive, preventive, detective controls that we actually need to employ, right? Apart from that, fintech companies have a very unique perspective on data security, which is basically like a lot of our security is basically driven by regulatory requirements, right? So we are like a regulated entity, right? So which means that a lot of the things that we do with data are going to be basically regulated how the different regulatory bodies want us to basically like define, right? So most of the controls that we have in place are actually like driven from those, right? So, and which is very strict, which is like basically on top of everything that we do, which every other company does for basically protecting the data. So meaning that like you just mentioned about multi-factor authentication, data encryption, data masking or data identification and all those controls, right? Apart from that, like there's also like basically the requirement for segmentation of data, right? So and isolation of data. So we don't want the client's data to mix with somebody else's data as well, right? So that segmentation isolation is very, very important. Right. On top of that, apart from basically like making sure that we maintain the data sovereignty, right? So we have to have like a geolocation based data, like we do localization audits like every year to make sure that we make sure that the data is actually within India located. It does not go outside of India. So there's a lot of things that we do which are actually driven by regulations apart from the technical controls or the process controls that are required anyway for the data protection.
And so, what about the training part? How important it is to for employee training in terms of like cybersecurity landscape? Because I believe to stay updated and in this ever evolving space, how important it is to, especially employee training, and to make sure that training goes in a smooth process. So, our organization taking any steps to update the employees?
Absolutely right. So, training and awareness is basically the cornerstone for any kind of security program, right? So, and if you want to basically have a healthy data governance in your organization, you want to make sure that everybody is basically be able to understand what are the requirements and what are the controls to basically implement, right? So we do a lot of training programs, and we do a lot of basically awareness campaigns as well, right? So we do a lot of like phishing simulations, we do a lot of basically like fraud detection simulations. On top of that, we do regular trainings for all the employees, which is like mandatory, right? So we want to ensure that entire organization actually goes through that training to understand like what is their respective responsibility towards safeguarding their own data, the company data, as well as the customer data. So because customer data is something that we are basically custodians, right? So we basically are their custodians, right? So it's additional responsibility for us to make sure that what are our basically like responsibilities towards making sure the customer data is not actually like exploited or used for something that's not supposed to be, and making sure that only people who are supposed to have access to the data only they have the access to data. So we do programs both basically on the digital as well as offline. So we do the computer based trainings, we do like gamification of the trainings to make sure that okay, people understand like in practice like exactly like how does it actually look like, both the attack simulations as well as basically prevention simulation as well, to make sure that both sides of the training are actually covered. Yeah.
So one last question from my end. So, sir, any trend you see that is on the rise in 2024 in terms of, especially talking about the fintech sector? Uh, any particular trend you see that will boost the cybersecurity landscape in the fintech companies?
I think fintech companies actually have they have always been vulnerable to like multiple different attacks, right? Primarily like distributed denial of service, phishing, and basically like faking up apps and faking up domains and things like that, right? So I think that's the trend that we are actually seeing right now, and of course like the supply chain as well, right? So vendor risk is always going to be there. So I think these are the trends that we'll actually continue to see in 2024 and beyond.
Thank
All
you
right,
so much,
thank you
sir.
so much.
Thank you for your time, sir.